Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls Dissected. There's a system for blocking back-to-back invasions that has a surprising amount of detail to how it works. The mechanics get so obscure here that no one ever noticed how a big component of it was cut entirely from the remaster. It's a discovery I made while making this video. Once you see how it all works, I think most players will feel that it was underutilized and didn't go far enough. We'll also consider the ramifications of invasion cooldowns for the series as a whole. I believe it's a severely underrepresented mechanic when it comes to the topic of invasion balancing. So let's take a closer look at the invasion cooldown timers of Dark Souls 1. Behind the scenes, there's several different timers for blocking certain network activity. There's one for players who were invaded by red phantoms, another for dark moons, another for the victims of Gravelords, and one that relates to sending and receiving vagrants. Let's start off by taking a closer look at the first two, since they're the most relevant and actually apply to invasions. Players who are invaded by a dark wraith, or any red phantom, meaning someone who's using either version of the red eye orbs, will have a timer that's set to 15 minutes when the phantom leaves their game. While this timer is running, you can't be invaded by another red phantom, giving you a 15-minute window to get through the level undisturbed. The manner in which the hostile phantom leaves doesn't matter, regardless if the host wins or loses, or if the invader disconnects or uses the black separation crystal to leave. The game only cares that a red phantom was present in some capacity, and the timer will start counting as soon as they're gone. The only exception to this is if the host disconnects to escape the invader. A host who quits out of the game won't have the cooldown start, unwittingly making themselves open to instant invasions every time they reload. Now, I'm not saying everyone has to enjoy dealing with invasions in these games, but I'm reminded of a time where I kept invading the same disconnecting player over and over in Anor Londo. They were pretty salty and even sent some hate mail over it. To me, it's just kind of funny that in refusing to either simply play offline or fighting with me normally just once, they were the ones responsible for my invasion attempts being able to target them repeatedly, when I was just trying to invade any random player and not harass them specifically. Oops. Anyways, the exact same timer system existed for Dark Moon invaders as well. However, it had its own separate timer that only applied to Dark Moons, meaning the other cooldown running for Dark Wraiths didn't stop Dark Moons from showing up, and vice versa. Bear in mind that no such timer existed for other forms of multiplayer, aside for the Gravelords, and I'll get to that in a minute. So if you have a hazy memory of getting invaded constantly without using the dried finger, you're probably thinking of stuff like Forest Hunters being able to show up non-stop. There were no cooldown timers for that, which was clearly intentional. Oh, and I should probably also mention that, for similar reasons, the Dark Moon timer only applied to invasions conducted with the Blue Eye Orb. It didn't apply to the ring-based invasions for Dark Anor Londo, since they wanted that to be a chaotic PvP zone, just like the Forest. One last thing to mention before moving on is that the cooldowns can only be triggered by other players online. Invading NPCs won't be blocked by cooldowns, nor will they cause them to start. Though one obscure detail here is that if you have a cooldown running, it'll pause while the NPC is present. Instead of waiting the whole 15 minutes, it was also possible for a host to clear their invasion cooldown, if they wanted to be open to more invasions. The most obvious tool for doing this was the dried finger, where that was its explicit purpose. Well, sort of. The original version of the game neglected to say anything about what it actually does in its item description. It wasn't until Dark Souls Remastered came out that they clarified its purpose in-game. Using the dried finger would not only clear all of the current cooldown timers you may have running, but until the next time you died or reloaded, it would remain active and prevent new timers from starting, so you only had to use it once a session. But it wasn't the only item to do this. The Eye of Death also has the same effect. This means that Gravelords were considered a top priority for being able to be invaded. Not only from the players finding their summon signs, but even for any random Dark Wraith showing up by coincidence. They really wanted players to be able to group up and take them down. Though there is a weird quirk to how the Eye of Death keeps the timer cleared. In what looks like a contradiction to what I just said, the cooldown timer actually turned on a few seconds ago. Unlike the dried finger, it doesn't keep this perfectly clear. Instead, it can take a moment to go away. I think it's probably happening when the Eye of Death sends out our latest invasion sign. So while it does generally keep our invasion slots open, you'll get these mini cooldowns on Dark Wraiths and Dark Moons that might last up to 30 seconds or so. And there's a few more multiplayer items that can also clear the cooldown timers. Using the Red Eye Orbs or the Red Sign Soapstone would clear any timers you had running as well. Although this was just a one-time clear and not a continuously running effect like the Dried Finger or Eye of Death. The reasoning behind this makes a lot of sense to me, at least for the invasion items. They figured that if you're someone who's trying to invade someone else, you shouldn't have your own protection with a cooldown timer. The invader should be invadable as well, ignoring the fact that they might have their boss defeated, but that's a subject of discussion for another video. But you notice what they don't clear the cooldown timers for? Dark Moons. Unlike the Red Eye Orb, you're free to invade with the Blue Eye Orb as much as you want without clearing any cooldowns you might have protecting you. I find this pretty cool, because it's yet another layer of how the mechanics support what the Dark Moons are meant to be on a conceptual level. By punishing sinners, Dark Moon invasions were seen as something more like a community service by the developers. It was the only invasion item that allowed you to invade far below your own level, meaning they were more than happy to give the Dark Moons an advantage in PvP. Though it's an extremely subtle effect that most players probably never noticed, the way they handled the cooldown timers also reflects this favorable bias towards the Dark Moons. They're the ones whose invasions are condoned, essentially, in both its lore and mechanics. Now, the biggest surprise here that I think most viewers won't know about is how the cooldown timers actually had an extension system. If you got invaded too many times back to back, the length of the cooldown timer would increase. They seem to have wanted to implement a system that would temper invasions if they were too frequent. However, the system arguably didn't go far enough, and it was so niche that no one ever even noticed its absence from Dark Souls Remastered. The system apparently only exists in the original version of the game, and I only discovered this just a few days ago, in the process of making this video. Unless I missed something somewhere, I'm pretty confident you're hearing about this for the first time right now. Now, invasion cooldowns still exist in Dark Souls Remastered. They're just locked at the standard 15 minutes, and it doesn't do any of the fancy stuff I'm about to explain. How it works in the Prepare to Die edition, or any version on PS3 and Xbox 360, is that once your cooldown timer clears and you're open to invasions again, something called the OB timer will run. This is a follow-up timer, where if another invasion occurs before this secondary timer runs out, it's going to keep track and it'll increase something in the data known as your limit level. This is your counter for how many times you've been invaded consecutively, and the higher your limit level is, the longer your cooldown timer will be. I think this was actually a great idea, but I suspect a lot of you watching this are going to be a little confused. Because if you played this game back in its glory days, you're probably pretty confident that you never got much more than 15 minutes between Dark Wraith invasions. So what gives? Why didn't this seemingly work? Well, let's go through it. You are considered limit level 1 after your first invasion. This gives you the standard 15-minute cooldown with a 10-minute follow-up timer. Get invaded within those 10 minutes after your cooldown clears, and the length of your cooldown increases to, well, it doesn't increase at all. It's 15 minutes again. Get invaded a third time, and after that third invasion ends, now your cooldown timer is 20 minutes long instead. Okay, so at least it's going somewhere, but the follow-up timer starts to become a little more strict. Now instead of having 10 minutes for something to count as a consecutive invasion, that window is shortened to 8 minutes instead. Okay, so let's say now you get invaded a fourth time, bringing your limit level to 4, it's still just 20 minutes. It's not until you reach limit level 6 that the cooldown timer increases to 25 minutes. But now, the follow-up timer decreases to a 5-minute window, getting a lot more strict. And this applies to limit levels 7 and 8 as well. So it's not until your 9th consecutive invasion that it finally reaches a 30-minute cooldown. And this is where it caps. There is technically a 10th limit level, but it uses the same values as limit level 9, so that's just kind of a redundant copy at that point. To add insult to injury, the follow-up timer is now only 3 minutes long. This means that for an invasion to still be considered consecutive, it really truly has to be consecutive. There's very little wiggle room here. Something that isn't a near immediate back-to-back invasion after the cooldown ends won't keep this train going. And what happens when you don't get invaded within the allotted follow-up time? It deletes everything. You don't just stay where you were or get bumped back down a limit level, it completely clears and your next invasion will be treated the same as your first. You'll be back down to limit level 1, and your cooldowns will only be 15 minutes long again. This is pretty ridiculous, and it brings me to the next thing I'd like to discuss: the missed opportunities of balancing invasion frequency. We'll get back to talking about obscure cooldown mechanics in a bit. I have even more new discoveries on the way, but let's talk about some of the broader implications on the game design. It's kind of wild to me how the limit level system was horrendously underutilized in Dark Souls 1. They created this entire system that, if leveraged correctly, could have had a major impact on how casual players felt about the threat of PvP. At any point they could have patched the numbers to have a steeper increase with more generous follow-up timers, especially instead of just getting rid of it in Dark Souls Remastered. but they preemptively nerfed their own system so hard that no one ever noticed it without data mining. Like, it's not just that people didn't notice its absence from the remaster, but the general player base didn't know it was in the original game either. Not until it was data mined by Wolf2K, when the game was already 5 years old. Now, I don't have any clear answers as to what these numbers should have been instead, but I just know that having to be invaded 9 times consecutively, with the follow-up timer dwindling down to something as strict as 3 minutes, just to see the length of the cooldown get an extra 15 minutes, that's pretty absurd. I think I know how we got here. Demon's Souls didn't have an invasion cooldown system, so the developers probably felt that including this at all was already pretty generous, and they didn't think about it any further. But it is interesting to me how cooldowns are often absent from the usual discussions about balancing invasions, when in my opinion, this should be a huge consideration. The frequency at which invasions can happen, the opportunity to be invaded at all, I think that's just as important as all of the work that goes into balancing the PvP itself. These global cooldown settings that you could tweak, these have massive ramifications on the overall vibe of PvP, and a tiny fraction of the development effort that goes into balancing weapons and gear, or even stuff like the matchmaking formulas. Think about it. As annoying as it was in Dark Souls 1 to get crushed by a twink in the Undead Parish, even without doing anything to mess with the level ranges to try and prevent that from happening, this wouldn't be nearly as notorious of a thing if it was simply less common. I think when talking about this stuff, there's inevitably going to be a few of the get good types not wanting to hear about PvP being more generous to hosts. The kinds of people who will tell you that you should just be playing offline if you can't handle PvP. But just to let you know where I'm coming from, I love the PvP in these games, despite not even being good at it. I'll never forget my first time being invaded in Demon's Souls. I think I vaguely knew about PvP prior to that, but had forgotten while actually playing the game, so it came as a huge surprise in the moment. I saw the invasion notification pop up, and I hid in one of the starting cells in Latria, like a complete coward. It took the other player a few minutes to find me, but once they did, it wasn't much of a fight at all, and they kicked my ass. And I loved it. There was a certain audacity to it. I feel like my jaw probably dropped, thinking, this is something else I have to deal with? Are you kidding me? But it wound up being this pretty cool sort of singular event. Not that I didn't also get invaded in some other parts of the game, but the point is that I lost my human form, and with the item that regains human form being in limited supply, I was permanently uninvadable during my next attempt in the area, and I was free to once again try and escape the Latria prison, completely at my own pace. And this made me appreciate the PvP. Hiding in that cell was a genuinely interesting and unique experience. It felt completely out of left field compared to what the level was normally throwing at me. Now, of course, you could stay hollow to avoid being invaded in Dark Souls 1 as well, but things were a bit different here. Demon's Souls didn't have NPC summons, nor did it have anything like kindling bonfires, and you didn't avoid going human because of anything like world tendency, so there were incentives to become human more often in Dark Souls. Add on to this that the gargoyles can be a pretty major obstacle for a lot of new players, and it created a situation where players were going to insist on becoming human much more often than they were in any of the Demon's Souls areas. While I got introduced to PvP in a pretty relaxed way, dying once and then not having to worry about it again for a long time, that's just not the experience a lot of people had in Dark Souls. While 15 minutes is enough time to work with if you're already familiar with the game and want to use the cooldown timer to your advantage, without knowing how any of these systems work, it's understandable that this time was going to be wasted by a lot of players. Maybe deciding to take a bathroom or snack break after dying, or maybe they're spending some time retrieving their bloodstain and then returning to Andre to make some purchases. There's just a lot of things that could naturally eat into the protected window of time, where the end result is that it still feels like the game is allowing frequent, consecutive invasions. I don't know if it really would have taken away from the experience if maybe the first cooldown was 20 or 25 minutes long, and if the follow-up immediately jumped up to 30 minutes or something like that, rather than taking 9 invasions to get there. There was a way to ensure that players going human to look for co-op were still at risk of being invaded as a counterbalance to co-op, without the frequency feeling so overbearing. I'm firmly on the side that they didn't temper invasion frequency enough, but I'm still in favor of places like the forest being a free-for-all, so it's not like I'd want everything like that taken away from the game. When it comes to experimenting with cooldowns, Dark Souls 2 makes for an interesting example. In that game, some of the protections against invasions were taken away. You can now be invaded while you were hollow, and also in areas where the boss was already defeated. And the cooldown against standard invasions was only 5 minutes long instead of 15. This probably sounds really harsh compared to Dark Souls 1, both shortening the length of the cooldown and taking away the two things that blocked invasions. But why did it kind of balance out and often feel less worse here? It's because whenever you defeated a boss, a different cooldown timer kicked in that blocked all multiplayer activity for 30 minutes. or you could also burn a human effigy at a bonfire to induce this effect at any time, if you wanted. I may be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't until Scholar of the First Sin that the game explicitly showed you the exact amount of time you had left. But in addition to this display, it also showed you a status effect in the HUD to let you know that at least something was happening. While I'm a little torn on whether Dark Souls 1 needed to show you the exact amount of time you had left, a more generous timer, combined with more information about how it exists in the first place, did a lot to help with invasion frequency. Dark Souls 3 took this to an extreme, where a de facto invasion priority system was the result of what was essentially an infinitely long cooldown timer. I don't know if all of its exact workings were ever data mined at a deeper level, but basically, outside of the special PvP zones, you only opened yourself to standard invasions if you engaged in multiplayer activity. So if someone got invaded by a red invader, died, and then re-embered and waited around to get invaded again, it didn't matter if they waited 15 minutes, or an hour, or literally days. They simply were never going to get invaded again. Not until they did something to clear that invasion block, and one of the things that cleared this was summoning co-op help. So players noticed that the game seemed to prioritize invading hosts who had co-op summons present, but the underlying reason for this wasn't just because the game was deciding to pick someone with summons over someone else. It's because that same player you just invaded with those summons present was often completely uninvadable until they summoned help. I guess at that point it's probably more like an invasion toggle rather than an invasion cooldown, but it's basically the same idea being pushed to its limit. As the series progressed, solo invasions went from being a regular occurrence to something that happens rarely or not at all without summoning help first. It's clear they don't want another Dark Souls 1 situation, but I feel like they've gone from one extreme to the other and we're missing a sort of middle ground. Especially by the time of Elden Ring, I really missed sporadic invasions while I was just running around on my own. I know some people are going to tell me that, in that case, I should be using the dried finger equivalent, but I could not disagree more. That's completely different. What I miss is being able to be invaded on occasion. In Demon's Souls, it was fun and interesting to be invaded every now and again, at a rate where it didn't feel like it bogged me down. It also happened just infrequently enough to be surprising. Something to keep me on my toes every now and again, and offer a fresh experience for the area that I'm in. The idea of having to pick between these two extremes isn't ideal to me, where now in Elden Ring, I have to summon help to get invaded, and then I know it's coming. Or I have to use an item that says I'm open to invaders constantly, and that completely takes away all of the element of surprise. It just doesn't scratch that same itch even remotely. Now, I understand that this is all just my personal preference, and not some objective critique of how PvP is supposed to be or anything, but I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. I believe that invasion cooldown timers are underexplored in regards to all of this, and some more nuanced experimentation with them could go a long way in hitting that sweet spot for invasion frequency. Okay, so before we finish out the video, let's get back to some weird mechanical stuff. Earlier I mentioned that Gravelording also has a cooldown timer, and it does. It's this one here. It is its own third timer that works exactly the same as the Dark Wraith and Dark Moon timers. It uses the same limit level system, and it's logged in the exact same debug menu and everything. So despite being technically identical in every way, there's a couple reasons I like to single it out as its own weirder thing. On a conceptual level, it's just not as important as it doesn't relate to blocking invasions. What it blocks is being cursed by a Gravelord Servant, something that pretty much only matters in New Game Plus and beyond. But also, on a mechanical level, it's not as predictable and trustworthy as the other timers. It's supposed to turn on when you get the "disasters are gone" message, but this message will also appear if disconnected Gravelording just finished, in which case, the cooldown timer won't start. This means that, when you see this message, unless you killed the Gravelord yourself, you have no idea if the cooldown has even started or not, as you have absolutely no idea how the Gravelord died, or if you were still properly connected to them. Whether or not the cooldown is active for you will feel completely random from your perspective, which is pretty weird. If you have no idea what I mean by disconnected Gravelording and would like to know more, you can check out my video on Gravelording. So, do we have any idea why the whole limit level system was removed from the remaster? I'm not sure if this was intentional or not. The debug menu that houses these cooldown timers in the original was a folder called SOS Sign Manager. If we try looking this up in the debug menu for the remaster, it's missing entirely. It's not a huge surprise because of how all the networking stuff was reworked, but I just find it interesting that there's a place where you can see the cooldown timers do their thing in the original. And while the bare bones 15-minute timer still works in the remaster, I have no idea where they tucked that. Maybe it's server side now? Anyways, I think it's entirely possible that for the remaster, they just forgot to re-implement the system when overhauling the netcode. But it's also possible they knew about it, and just considered it too ineffective to bother recreating. Now, the Vagrant Cooldown timer is something else entirely. It's not covered in the same menu in debug, it's found in its own menu that's purely dedicated to Vagrant stuff. And this is where I have a couple new discoveries as well. I should start by saying that what we did know is that killing any kind of Vagrant, or even picking up a drift item bag, will cause the timer to start. But unlike the invasion cooldowns, it doesn't start if you leave them alone and they get away from you. But I previously didn't fully understand how this timer works. I mistakenly thought you couldn't send or receive Vagrants while any part of it was running. The weird part to me was that it used two different timers that were daisy-chained to each other. When I was testing and figuring out Vagrant mechanics way back in the day, I must have made a mistake and toggled another setting that screwed things up. It seems a bit obvious in hindsight, and if I had a better understanding of Japanese, it should have been clear that the second timer was also a follow-up timer. It works pretty much just like the invasion cooldowns. So it's only this timer here that actually blocks sending and receiving Vagrants. And when it does, it thankfully doesn't erase Vagrants you create during this time. Your game will just hold on to them. They won't actually be in your world or anything, but it'll just wait to send them out once the timer clears. We can see what this looks like behind the scenes. Here I'm dying to lose a bloodstain and create another Vagrant, and at the bottom we'll see an additional line of text appear. This is the Vagrant we just created, trapped in what is essentially our outbox. If I clear the cooldown and then die again, we'll see the Vagrant disappear from the menu, because it was finally able to be sent off to another player without the cooldown stopping it. It should be noted that, unlike the other cooldown timers, you can't use a dried finger or do anything to get rid of it. In a second you'll see me clear it using debug, but there's no known way to do this normally and you'd just have to wait a half hour. One interesting quirk of the cooldown timer is how harshly it handles blocking the presence of Vagrants. If you're incredibly lucky to find yourself in a situation where you have two Vagrants or drift items at once, you'll find that killing or picking one up makes the other one disappear instantly. As you can see, it's not handled in a smooth way where it fades out of existence or anything, it just kind of vanishes in a glitchy way. This is because they very likely didn't anticipate someone interacting with more than one Vagrant at a time, and the cooldown timer turning on just immediately gets rid of them. However, just because they didn't anticipate how that would look visually doesn't mean it was totally overlooked, because it thankfully doesn't completely erase them from existence, nor does it count it as killing them. Whatever disappears on you will be put into your outbox to be sent back out to another player, once your cooldown clears. It is sending this back out properly. Okay, so here's the new information. If you're lucky enough to find another Vagrant or drift item when the follow-up timer is running, killing or picking it up to trigger another cooldown does what you're expecting. It increases your limit level and the length of your cooldown, just like it does for invaders. But the times involved and the total number of limit levels are different. It only goes up to limit level 4, increasing the length of the cooldown from 30 minutes to just 40 minutes. In a recent video I made about Seek Guidance, I referred to one of the hidden messages as the most useless thing in the game, but I think this probably outdoes it. It's not like players are seeing Vagrants frequently enough that a 30-minute cooldown isn't sufficient if they somehow are being bombarded with them. When this system only increases to a length of 40 minutes, it's like, what's the point? How much worse is that than 30 minutes? But it can be more punishing than it seems, because of how waiting out the follow-up timer differs from invasions. Remember that for invasions, not getting invaded during the follow-up time, and thus failing to increase your limit level, meant that all progress was cleared and wiped to 0. For Vagrants, it doesn't do that. It drops you back down a single limit level instead. Though in the process of doing so, it doesn't just go back down the list of only the follow-up times, which would make the most sense to me. Instead, it treats it like you just arrived at that specific limit level, which means it's going to go through both timers again. This means that, even without seeing or killing another Vagrant at all, the cooldowns will activate again on their own. It's going to go through all of this backwards. So let's say you got all the way to limit level 4. You're going to have 40 minutes where you can't see any Vagrants, then a 30-minute window where you can. But if you don't get any during those 30 minutes, then you're going to have another 40 minutes where you can't see any again, followed by a 40-minute window where you can. So as you can see, it's going to go through all of these numbers in this order. Basically, if you get to limit level 4, and you're wondering when this nonsense will finally end, the next time you can permanently see them without these automatically toggling waiting periods will be a 4-hour and 20-minute wait. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Dark Souls is a deeply weird video game, and it's the gift that keeps on giving. In making this video, I was expecting to recap things I already knew, having written the page on the cooldown timers a bunch of years back. But the moment I tried retesting things and digging a little bit deeper, I discovered a few things that went unnoticed. And while I'm not too surprised that the details of the Vagrant timer were seemingly never found, the absence of invasion limit levels from Dark Souls Remastered being undiscovered until now makes me think of all of this as the Furtive Pygmy of Dark Souls mechanics. I think they're really important with big ramifications for multiplayer, but it feels like they're so easily forgotten. To close out the video, I'd like to ask, Do you know of any obscure mechanics from other video games that went unnoticed for a long time as well? If so, please leave a comment, I'd love to hear about it. Bonus points if it's a functioning system of some kind, and not just a traditional Easter egg or secret. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and doing all the usual things that can help. You can also support me directly on Patreon, that's patreon.com/illusorywall. I'd like to thank Metal Crow, Europa, FenotheFox, Karl Germ, Algi, Ariane, and HotPocketRemix for testing and multiplayer assistance. And also, an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.